Welcome to another Trench Chat, and I'm really pleased this week for us to be joined by military historian Dr. Tim Godden, who is not only a military historian, he's a talented artist, and indeed many more things besides. So thanks for joining us, Tim.
Thanks for having me along.
So I always start this by asking people how you got interested in the Great War and do you have a personal connection to it?
Yeah, I mean, my first experience of the war was a school battlefield trip when I would have been 11, I think. And it was my first overseas trip with the school as well. So there was all the excitement of that. And at the time, the history teacher, Chris Tooth, would send round a letter to all the parents and ask, did they have anyone, did they know of anyone within the family who'd been killed in the war? Because they then had to write off to the War Graves Commission, who would then write back with the list of those that they managed to find. And I remember my mum speaking with my great auntie Betty up in Scotland to find out if we had anyone. And she said, yeah, there was a chap called Thomas Wilson, but his fiance went out there after the war a number of times and never found him. So we don't know if you'll be able to find him. But sure enough, the War Graves Commission, the records had improved somewhat since the early 20s, and he was listed, or still is listed, on the Lewes Memorial at Dud Corner. And by sheer chance, the week before we were meant to go, I think one of the staff dropped out, and my mum, who worked in the school as well, was asked to come along as a kind of support for the group and controlling this gaggle of pre-teens. And I think that decision there meant that we ended up going to Lewes Memorial, because otherwise it was a bit off the beaten track from what you normally do on these kind of school tours over there. But because there was myself and my mum there, we kind of went the extra mile, as it were, and we went to see Tom's name, and we got the kind of the photographs pointing up to the name and everything like that. And to be honest, that wasn't the bit that really struck me at the time. Obviously, it's a powerful kind of thing seeing these cemeteries, but as an 11-year-old, you don't really process that. It wasn't until the summer afterwards that we went up to Scotland to see my auntie Betty and show these photographs. And she said, well, wait here, I think you should have these. And she kind of went out of the room, came back in a few minutes later, and just handed this little kind of goldy coloured cardboard box to me. And when I opened it up, there were two more little cardboard boxes in it. And as you probably guessed by now, they were the medals of my great Uncle Tom, or great Uncle Tom. And I guess at the time, they had an immediate impact. But then, life comes along and you become a teenager and other things start to take your interests. And they kind of, I always treasured them, but they didn't have the impact they were going to have. And it wasn't until I started my A-levels and I chose all the wrong A-levels and did a whole load of things that just were not suited to me at all. And the upshot of that was that I started to bunk off the lessons, but rather than bunk off lessons and head wherever the type of person that bunks off lessons heads to, I decided to go to the library and start reading about the First World War, because I always had this kind of latent interest in it. Just I don't know, there's maybe the wrong word, but there's a kind of romance about it which always was always with me. I can remember it as a child, and so I kind of picked up on that, and I began reading about it. And when I started reading about it, I thought, oh, hang on a minute, I've got those medals, haven't I? And of course, in those intervening years, things had started to get better with the internet, and you could start looking for information. And I was able to, piece together a bit of the information about my great Uncle Tom, and that obviously subsequently led me to restart my A-levels and choose subjects that were actually more in line with my interests. But I also at the same time discovered whilst just searching through the house for something else one day at the same kind of time period, I came across a memorial plaque in one of the drawers, and then underneath that was another box of medals, and it turned out these are my great grandfathers who'd been killed in 1918 and is buried out at Adelaide Cemetery. And those kind of two family stories were then the principal ones that then drove me on first and foremost to wanting to go back over to the battlefields and kind of with a bit more consciousness of the conflict and of them as individuals to go and see them. And then, that'd have been I'd have been 17, 18 at that time, and it's kind of snowballed from then. First of all, I kind of ended up with Taff Gillingham in the khaki chums, and as much as anything else, because it was a great way for me as a young man who couldn't drive at the time to get over to the battlefields and see it all firsthand and be with people who knew what on earth they were talking about, and see these kind of places. And it's just kind of snowballed from there in one way, shape or form.
And when you were with Taff and the khaki chums, you were there for that time that they dug the trench at Plugstert to get a sort of feel of what that must have been like for those lads. Yeah,
I mean, that was my first Christmas away from home. And I remember telling my basically what had happened. I'd gone away in the August of 1999 for the first time with a group of the chums to Le Cateau and Mons. And we'd, on the way back, we'd popped into Violet Farm, and in, a lovely kind of sun-drenched Belgium, we decided, wouldn't it be fun to come back at Christmas? And I was a bit...
Little did you know.
I was a bit reluctant at the time, but I thought, you know what, I don't want to miss this. It does sound like good fun. And I explained to my parents at a later date that I wasn't going to be around this Christmas because I was going to be in Belgium, sitting in a hole in the ground, dressed as a First World War soldier. And I think they accepted it in the end. Obviously, they had to, but it was a bit of a strange first Christmas away. But as a result, and I think probably the same for all of us that did that, there's no getting away that as a result of it, the kind of Plug Street landscape has a special resonance and a special place in my heart, because it's the first place I really remember of the Western Front. Everywhere else was a bit of a blur, and you were here, there, and everywhere. But this was the first time, albeit in a very small place of it, I was there for kind of 4 or 5 days, and you kind of got to absorb all the landscape, every essence, sometimes quite literally. You kind of really did get to know the place, and it's a place that I constantly return to now for that reason, because there's an ever so slight part of it feels a little bit like home.
And that exercise wasn't just about putting on some khaki and digging a hole in a Flanders field. It was, in some respects, a bit of experimental archaeology, wasn't it, to sort of see what those positions were like and get a bit of an insight into the experience of those men there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I was still pretty young at the time, so it was there was obviously that element, as you say, of kind of learning, about trench construction, about how it holds up, how does the kit hold up. So there were all those kind of lessons to be relearnt, but at the same time, it was also a chance to get away and be somewhere you wanted to be at Christmas.
Well, yeah, and I think you're right though that when you spend a bit of time in a location like that, you do take a bit of the landscape, a bit of the place back away with you. And I remember when we were working on the dig at Bosinger, going down in the dugout there, and you end up with blue clay up your nostrils and in all sorts of places, and somehow it's never quite the same again afterwards.
No, absolutely. I mean, I know with everything I did after Plug Street, it was always kind of tinged with a little bit of, it wasn't the same as that, though, was it? Because you didn't often get that. The only other time that we had that same prolonged period was when we did the filming for The Trench. And, we were just outside Flekier. But again, that still didn't have the same kind of connection with me as Plug Street did. And to the point that when I used to when I was still doing the stuff in uniform, I used to have a little red bag, little red paper bag, and inside it was some soil from Plug Street that I used to keep on the inside of my hat rim, so that there was always a little bit there with me.
Wow, wow. And all these things that you describe really are sort of, they are mirroring the experience of soldiers who were there in the Great War. They did all these sort of things, and these places meant the same to them.
Yeah, I think for everyone that visits the battlefield, they do. There is a kind of a continuous thread between that experience of the veteran, certainly the returning veteran, and all of us that have gone back since, because you're still trying to experience the landscape in the way that they experienced it, or trying to understand it in the way they experienced it, at least. So there is a connection there. And I think, when you look at what the chums did, it stands to reason that some of the things you end up doing are some of the things that they did at the time. I can remember quite vividly hearing the kind of anglicized names being kind of uttered amongst the ranks, and thinking, I bet that's exactly what happened at the time. And then which did lead me into another thread when I was doing my doctoral research, thinking how much of that kind of Tommy parlance for places is genuine, and how much of it is stuff that was just picked up on tours afterwards with people who were equally bad at pronouncing Belgian and French names. But I think there is, as you say, I think there's a continuity in that experience.
And you mentioned your PhD there. Landscape memory and the meaning of it all is a big part of what you've done. And recently you finished your PhD. You look in that at the architect and the architecture of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, or then the Imperial War Graves Commission. Could you tell us a bit about the sort of research you did for that?
Yeah, I mean, it started out, as I guess is the case of every single PhD that's ever been done. It started out as one thing, which was to be a look at the junior architects specifically, and how the war graves had influenced their post-war architectural careers. But as is often the way with anything you do with the old battlefields, they kind of had their own plan for what I was going to be doing. And I started to notice this very strong correlation between cemetery sites and the battlefield maps, the trench maps. And so I kind of started exploring that. And the more I got into that, the more I kind of began to unravel the fullness of the design process in these cemeteries. Obviously, we kind of look at them and think, the uniform white headstones, and they're very well kept. And, you visually, there's a language there that you can spot a British war cemetery in the landscape, from miles away, because, you kind of, as I say, there's that language that you can identify with. But what I was looking at went kind of beyond that and started looking at the nuances, because whilst, yes, there's all those uniform elements that define them as a British war cemetery, what defines them as an individual memorial space is the nuance at each site. And it was that I began to explore with how the architects, and particularly the junior architects, dealt with the individual sites, and how they approached certain elements of design, and also the function of the landscape within that design, and their experience of the landscape during the war in those designs. So yeah, as I say, it started off as one thing, and whilst it is an architecture PhD, I think more and more, particularly now kind of reflecting on it, it's actually more about landscape and the way we connect with the landscape, and the way the architects hoped we would connect with the landscape through their architecture.
I mean, I found it an absolutely fascinating study that you've done there, and I really hope that you'll publish something on this. And there were sort of elements to it that I particularly sort of honed in on, and the section on trenches, for example, and the incorporation of trenches into cemeteries. And there are famous ones like the Devonshire Cemetery, of course, but it's a much wider context than that, isn't it?
It is. I mean, Devonshire is a very important one, in that, as you say, the story is there of the men being buried in the trench there, but the kind of the context of the cemetery and the route you take to it, that they're all planned elements of the design. It's not just, there's obviously the making permanent of a temporary cemetery in the, you know, turning the filled-in trench into headstones. But then there's the way you enter that. When you think about that site, realistically, you could have entered that site from a number of other points other than the one you do enter it. But the point that you do enter it is, and next time you're there, you know, I'm sure you've done it already, with your linesman there, you'll see that you follow the same arc of the trench up into the cemetery. So you're still following that line. There's, you know, yeah, it's really, it was quite a remarkable thing kind of discovering that, because somewhere like Devonshire, you know the story around it. So you assume there must be some kind of geometric correlation between the trench and the actual burials. But certainly in other places, you know, places that you wouldn't necessarily expect, there were really, really nice correlations between, I mean, principally the way you enter into the cemetery space. So not just that the headstones are laid out in the trench line, but the actual access point where you pass from the modern world into this kind of permanently retained battlefield site, you pass through the same axes that the trench line takes. And, you know, there were too many of them like that for it to be a coincidence. And also, kind of looking at it, quite frequently, the junior architect that had designed them had served in that area. They knew the trenches. It wasn't just a kind of a, you know, whim. They understood the landscape, how it functioned in the as a, you know, as war experience. They understood it, and they kind of capture that permanently in stone. And so we, when we visit now, still move on those same paths, whether we realise it or not. We're kind of passing through those same spaces, and that, I think, certainly for me, it kind of compressed the time difference. You know, the history came that much closer. Obviously, you're visiting a historical site anyway, but when you can categorically say, well, this is a divergence here, this is where it's pulling our two time spaces together, it made them such kind of powerful hotspots of memory to kind of pass through.
Yeah, and I think it also, I mean, a lot of people just say, well, it's just another cemetery, they're all the same. But then once you begin to look under the history of this, you can see that is not the case at all. And I really love this idea of these men who'd served themselves, the junior architects, the echoes of their own war service is perpetuated forever in the design and the layout of those cemeteries.
Yeah, I mean, like the architect that stood out most for me, Wilfred von Berg. No guesses where my second son's name comes from. You know, he had such an interesting war experience, and then that panned out into how he designed the memorial space that we all engage with when we go back there. And he also had the very unfortunate task of designing the cemetery that his own brother was buried in. So he really he had every element of the experience of designing war cemeteries he had to undergo, and aside from the kind of obvious things like, you know, designing LRB cemetery, where he would have known men in that cemetery. You know, he frequently appears in the London Rifle Brigade history because he becomes the adjutant, and he becomes the adjutant more than likely because he was a sergeant in the London Rifle Brigade. He's sent off for officer training just before the 1st of July. And of course he comes back and he's, you know, there aren't many originals left in there. And it stands to reason that they want an LRB man to be the adjutant and be the kind of the representative of the battalion. And then he stays out there until long after the end of the war, until, you know, one day he happens to have a note fluttering onto his desk saying that they're looking for architects. He'd completed his architecture training in about 1914, so he's got very little experience before the war, and this becomes his kind of, this is his, not only his kind of entrance into architecture, but it gets, and I think it's the same for all of the architects, that kind of cathartic experience for them as well. They get to not necessarily exercise the ghosts, but they get to learn to live with them. And I think that's a huge thing you see with all the architects. They kind of, when they decide to leave, they are obviously feeling that their work's done, and not in necessarily the building of memorial sense.
No, that's interesting, because another London Rifle Brigade man, Henry Williamson,
Mm.
turned to fiction to try and deal with his war experiences, and that's a common thread as well, fictionalizing your war to try and come to terms with it. And it's interesting that men like von Berg did that with the architecture. I mean, he was in the right place at the right time to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the obvious one is Charles Holden, who, whilst he's a senior architect, he is very much nearer to the junior architects than the principal architects in terms of notoriety and recognition. And his architecture just undergoes such an enormous change with his kind of designing of the war cemeteries. Before the war, he's very arts and crafts, and there's lots of kind of, as you'd expect with arts and crafts, lots of kind of detailing. And then when he starts working on the cemeteries in France, he does Forceville and Louvencourt. They are about as stark a cemetery as you're ever likely to find. He does Corby, which is another one. These kind of Passchendaele New British Cemetery. These are all quite early cemeteries on his trajectory, and they are stripped back architecture. That they are brutal in how stripped back they are. And I think it's interesting to see how he then gets paired up, because obviously those early ones he's working on his own. He then gets paired up with William Cowlishaw, who's another arts and craft schooled architect and designer as well. And when they get paired up, you do see this kind of softening. There's still a starkness bit from the Holden element of things, but you see in the choice of materials as much as anything else, and just slight details here and there. So you see this real balancing of his own personal architectural style, which you then obviously see come through in the London Underground stuff later on. But the language that you see at the London Underground is one that is refined in those early years with the War Graves Commission, where he's finding his own proper expression. But again, that kind of cathartic process of the war as a line in the sand, and then moving on beyond that.
And trenches are one landscape feature in the cemeteries. Craters is another one, shell craters and indeed mine craters.
Yeah, I mean, again, for similar reasons, on the battlefield, they're a pre-dug grave. But it's so the kind of their use in the first place is of one element of interest, and there's certainly other research going on that kind of looks at that. But from my point of view, it's the decision to keep them like that, and not to just keep them like that, but to explicitly portray them as that within the way that they decide to design the memorial. There's the obvious ones like Zivvy Crater, but then you get the slightly kind of less obvious ones like Hedgerow Trench, where it wasn't a crater burial, but the identities or the exact locations of the cemeteries are lost because of a crater. So it's just kind of capturing the narrative that makes the cemetery what it is in the way it's designed, made permanent. And again, you get things like at Messines, where you've got the suggestions of the mine going up as you arrive at the cemetery there, and you approach down a trench, and then you kind of come into the Cross of Sacrifices kind of on this great dome rising up above you. And there's such evocative places of the connection with the landscape. The craters and shell holes are, again, just another part of that kind of trying to capture the wartime landscape in a permanent way that means you still, whether you realize it or not, relate in some way whenever you visit to the landscape as it was.
Indeed, and fake craters as well, like Hoog. I mean, it's to symbolise the battle rather than be an actual crater itself.
I remember being initially disappointed with that one. Thinking I was going to get there and be, this is brilliant. Look at it. It's actually this is going to be a crater. Whether it's Hoog crater or not, there'll be a crater. There's not a crater there. Right. Oh, well, at least he's using the kind of iconography of the battlefield. And so there were a number of times like that throughout where you expect to find something. Regina Trench was another one where I thought, this is going to have it. One of these walls is going to be Regina Trench, isn't it? And I got there and Regina Trench cuts off the corner of it. And I thought, okay. And to be honest, there are a number of ones that are called something trench that are, adjacent to where the trench was, rather than any kind of direct link. But the Hooge there, that was one of those ones I thought, that's disappointing. But at the same time, it opened another avenue. Okay, now I need to start looking at these cemeteries in a way of how are they communicating the kind of the landscape in other ways as well. And Hooge in itself has got the other element, which I think is another really important part of the design process. It's got their viewing platform at the back, just like you have at Caterpillar Valley as well. And there's a number of places that have some form of viewing platform, because these cemeteries are not inward facing. They're not designed to be inward facing. They're designed for you to be able to engage with the landscape. The cross of sacrifice, obviously, it brings the Christian symbolism into the cemetery space. But from the architect's point of view, and it appears in the notes, they are using them as kind of markers in the landscape. And if you think about being something like Munich Trench or something like that, if you look back to Thiepval from Munich Trench, you will see every single cemetery on the way back there. And you can kind of see this, you can begin to fill in the gaps in between. It suddenly doesn't just become an isolated cemetery. It becomes part of a broader landscape of memory. And part of, I firmly believe that the decision-making process to why they kept the cemeteries where they kept them was for exactly that reason, to give you that much broader sense of what this is about. This isn't just about this small cemetery with however many people buried in it. It's about beyond. And I think those things like the crater at Hooge do exactly the same thing. They kind of echo the landscape that isn't there anymore in the permanent architecture.
Yeah, because I guess at the time that they were working on these, the landscape that they'd known was already beginning to disappear, and this was a way of, to a degree, preserving it.
Yeah, I think, there's certainly very quickly that they're losing. The last few months of the war are so fundamentally different from most of the rest of the war that even by the end of the war, quite a few of the trenches and the kind of traditional view of the First World War battlefield have grown over, fallen in, done whatever. They're not needed anymore. So there's no need to waste resources on keeping them in place. So there is, it's one of the drivers for all these people wanting to get out there so early for the battlefield tourism side of things, is because they don't want to miss it. It's a bit like the kind of 1914 recruitment campaigns. They don't want it to all be over before they get there. So they want to get out there and be able to see the craters and the ruined tanks and bits and pieces. And I think that the architects then have that kind of job of trying to make permanent a really, really transient landscape. And I think they do it very successfully in a lot of ways. Some of the places that you go to, and I'm sure you've been to many, many more cemeteries than I have, but they will have just the way that they cut up the landscape, the way you'll visualize a landscape through a kind of, well, you think about Passchendaele New British Cemetery, you are basically looking out through pillbox slits back out into the landscape. There are other places, I think Carnier, it's got a kind of a trench walkway up into the main cemetery, so you see everything at a trench eye view. I mean, not a particular place you'd want to have your head that high above a trench, but nonetheless you're kind of down at ground level looking across, and you get the same at Messines as well. And I think all these elements are such a big part of the way that those cemeteries are designed that we don't necessarily immediately pick up on. If you sit and think about it, you might start, you might realize it, but most people don't kind of take it on board, predominantly because nowadays our principal connection with the way that we kind of think about the war is through the people that fought it, and particularly with ancestry and the rise of family history, the kind of the personal story becomes the way that people access it. And so if you're only going there once or a couple of times, then you may not necessarily think about the broader memorial that's going on there. But certainly, I feel that it was designed to be considered en masse rather than individually.
Absolutely, and I think that's, reading your work, it's one of the things that comes across really strongly is how the role of these architects and the way that they sort of shaped remembrance is something that's not really properly been considered. If I think back to, the time when I first went over and read John Giles and Rose Coombs and books like that, they occasionally mentioned a senior architect of the commission, but only in passing, and there was none of this interpretation of the ground. And gradually, in visiting these places, you see these connections. And I think what you've done is you've brought all those connections together and really explained it in such an incredible way.
Yeah, as I say, I think it's just, and for yourself, it'd be the same thing. It's the amount of time you spend there. Certainly, I remember one of the kind of earliest elements of the research was just thinking, why do I keep coming back here? Why am I happy to come and sit in the cemetery? What is it? So initially, I was kind of considering, what is it about the architecture that makes it feel okay to return? So there's obviously the feeling that you need to go and visit these men and make sure they're not forgotten. But at the same time, it still needs to be a welcoming environment to go and do that. You're not going to, that wouldn't have happened for 100 years since if those cemeteries didn't feel to some extent like home. And so that was what kind of got me on that route, was tracking that down. And then when you then start trying to unpick those, you do start thinking, hang on a minute, that's a bit like that other cemetery. And oh, that's a bit like that. And so you start kind of building these little groups of approaches to designing the cemeteries. And I hope, in the long term that it will become a bit more accessible so that when people are out there, they'll be able to do the same thing as well.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope so too, because I think that it's all part of our understanding of it, and I think that one of the things that, again, that comes across from the work you've done, the cemeteries, the creation of the cemeteries was not just about the perpetuation of the memory of the dead. It was about preserving that landscape, as we've said, but also it then leads you on to think about those who did come back, the ones that did survive the war, which is the majority of them, of course. So they become bigger spaces than just about the hallowed memory of the fallen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the key point is that all of these are designed by veterans. They are designed for that veteran's gaze. They're designed by that veteran's gaze. So it's quite interesting when one of the kind of postdoctoral pieces that I've considered is exactly that, kind of trying to assess or trying to catalogue and analyse how did veterans engage with these spaces, because I think there's a fascinating piece there, because there were just a few nuggets that came out in the research. You find a photograph album, if you're particularly when you're looking at architecture, it's a very visual thing, so photograph albums were really useful. But what you always got in the photograph album of veterans kind of going off on one of these battlefield tours, either as an organised group or a bunch of mates, there's always some guy standing on the outside of the cemetery looking out into the field, or stand leaning up against the wall and looking out, because these are beacons. They are designed for you to be looking outwards. And they're also kind of, again, with even if there was no geometric correlation, just retaining the nomenclature of the battlefield allowed them to pinpoint themselves in the much changed landscape. You think in those early 20s, it's bad enough. You get into the early 30s, there's very little of those battlefields that you could, hand on your heart, say, that's definitely where I was on such and such a date. So these little markers, the cemeteries, yes, they house the fallen, and they do that very well. But they also enabled all those veterans returning to unpick a landscape that was gone forever. And just even if it was kind of loosely placing them in it, it enabled them to rebuild it. There's that wonderful quote within the research by H.A. Taylor, who is out at Point 110 Cemetery, and it's when he realizes at Point 110, he then understands where Shaftesbury Avenue is and all the various other kind of trenches that go off around there. But it's that realization of exactly where he is because of the name of the cemetery that he's able to, the map unfolds across the landscape.
Absolutely. I mean, over the years of taking groups, I've had people say to me, and they're always relatives of gunners or Army Service Corps men. My dad or my grandfather was at a place called Belgian Battery Corner. Now, I'm sure no such place exists.
Yeah.
And then you say, well, let me take you there. Not only does did it exist, but there is a cemetery that still perpetuates that name. So,
Yeah. Yeah, the naming element of it was something that I picked up on, because it's such a important part of the way that we remember the Western Front. It are the names. It is that kind of that very specific naming of places that we managed to establish throughout the war. That it's a really important part. It always, I think, and it must have been a much higher decision. I always find it a little bit sad that we don't get like Wipers Reservoir Cemetery. I think they would have been quite good, but maybe you would have lost maybe some of the pathos if you start using too much Tommy nomenclature. But it's still in there. You've got Bandageham, Mendingham, and Dosingham. That is just such brilliant Tommy humour, and there they are, and they look for every bit you'd imagine. Well, they do sound like Flemish names. They could be that's probably just the places they're in, and it's only when you unpick it you realise, oh no, hang on a minute, that's a joke. And so it's lovely that they kept those things, that kind of their wartime history, their wartime narrative defined what they became as their permanent memorial.
yeah, and I think again it all harks to their wider importance in the history of it, and on the wider landscape today. An interesting debate on Twitter recently about where should you start a battlefield tour, a museum, a cemetery, a battlefield, or another location. And of course, it's not as defined as that really, and the cemeteries prove that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a question like that really is going to depend entirely on who you're taking there for a start. But the cemeteries certainly. The cemeteries allow a much greater understanding, and I think they necessarily get the opportunity in most ways that people visit, because they are still considered as the kind of marker in the landscape, and so they do still retain that. But it's always a kind of inward-looking marker on the landscape. It's always about the stories of the men in them, rather than the fact that it's designed to kind of reflect the stories of everyone, not just the ones that are retained there. But yeah, the cemeteries. I'd always advocate starting at the cemetery because that's what my research has been on. But there are some fantastic museums from fantastic other sites as well. So I think you could probably make a case for all of them.
Yeah, I suppose my plea would be is not just to see them as cemeteries. It's something that I think more and more I feel this. The more time I spend in them, that it's not just about the names on the headstones and the graves of the unknown. It's not just about all of that. It's a much bigger thing.
Absolutely. I mean, you think of the most visited one, Tyne-Cot. That is designed. That has all the elements of the kind of the way the grander design approach that the War Graves Commission took. You think you've got in the middle, you've got not only a retained piece of the battlefield, it's converted into a viewing platform so you can see out of the cemetery. It's there's just so much about it that yes, it's an incredibly moving and powerful place to see all those graves in the one place. But part of the reason for you being able to look out is to think about where those graves were as well, not just about where they are now. The huge concentrations, the whole landscape is affected, not these small, relatively small enclaves. It's the whole landscape, and that's what I think the cemeteries, the people should kind of consider them more when they get there, is that broader approach. What else is this cemetery telling me? What else is it trying to do? Why have I come through this gate? Why is there a kink in that wall? All those kind of things that start to make you lift your eyes beyond the kind of perimeter walls and outwards. I mean, we all do it anyway, because particularly those of us that are interested in the landscapes, be it from a military point of view, be it from a memorial, cultural point of view, whatever it happens to be. We all do it, maybe not even realizing it. And the trick is for guides to encourage people that aren't that familiar with the landscapes to do exactly the same, to understand these cemeteries, not purely as cemeteries, but as viewing platforms not just onto the landscape, but onto the wartime experience, because that's what they do.
Yep, like you said, beacons in the landscape that draw us in to explain the wider picture.
Yeah, absolutely.
I could talk to you about the cemeteries all day, but I also wanted to talk about your the artwork that you do. I've got your Owl Trench prints on my bookcase at the moment, waiting to be framed shortly. I mean, your artwork is just incredible, Tim. It really is, and I think it it obviously reflects your deep interest and passion for the subject.
Yeah, it's to be honest, the research and the artwork are so heavily linked that they're not really. I don't really consider them that separate. Partly because the one only came about because of the other. The artwork initially started as a way of having spent the day researching cemeteries. I kind of didn't want to get out of the headspace and zone, but I needed to decompress from studying cemeteries all day. And so I started the artwork. And then obviously, as you know, the artwork kind of snowballed and got quite popular. But I think the themes that I pick up on it are are very much related. You know, throughout all my artwork, I don't really focus on the death because we all know that people died and we all know that they died horribly. And I don't need to sit down and capture that. You know it. But what a lot of people don't think about are those small moments of humanity, the real intimacy. And again, I think the landscape is a part of that within it. You know, you think about it from the Tommies' point of view, they didn't have a huge understanding of landscape. They had more often than not an understanding of a slit of sky above them and the kind of very intimate landscape that they're in, an architectural landscape really in many respects. And so that kind of claustrophobia I like to bring in that kind of not being able to see too much beyond them, but dealing with elements that you know that must have happened, but people don't often think about them happening.
No, I really like the ones where you've got old comrades going back and they're sitting on a wall together, and or there's family standing at a grave, and then there's a figure in the background. That's just incredibly moving because that's all aspect of pilgrimage, that post-war period that we think about, but you visualize it, which is great.
Well, I think it goes beyond the post-war as well, doesn't it? I mean, I placed them in the post-war because it fits with the kind of style of art that I do. But I think we all still think like that when we go there, don't we? I mean, if I go and sit in a cemetery and have my lunch, I don't think I'm in there on my own.
No, no.
And I'm sure that's for most people that go. That's one of the reasons you go, isn't it? Because you want to feel that connection.
Absolutely,
and so
yeah.
trying to kind of capture that trying not to be too mawkish about it is the other thing. Making it be kind of more true to actually how I feel, rather than trying to make it something a bit crass. And to be honest, it was something I battled with for quite a time. With do I want to put these kind of ethereal figures into these, or do I just leave them as kind of imagined? But I'm pleased I put them in there, and I should imagine they'll keep appearing. I mean, I feel like I live with them to some extent for the rest of my life anyway. So that only makes sense that they appear in the artwork.
Absolutely. And I've got a print on my wall actually by a man that served in the war, and it's a pen and ink of the 41st Division Memorial in Fleurs, and then he's painted in sort of white paint over the top of it the ghosts of soldiers fighting across that landscape. So it's something that the men themselves. It's not just our modern view of it. It's a man who was there himself felt exactly the same way.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've only got to look at the Longstaff series of paintings, and they're the same kind of thinking, aren't they? That this is a landscape that is full of the kind of echoes of footsteps of other people. Be they, immediately they're to do with the First World War soldiers, but going back since the dawn of man, kind of thing. There are other footsteps that have gone before us, and I think we focus in on the First World War ones. It just seemed a natural progression with it, that they started to emerge within the artwork.
And your current ones where you're looking at bird cemeteries named after birds, or the connection between birds and cemeteries, and that whole nature part of it. I mean, it's something that really appeals to me. I mean, this podcast starts with the sound of the skylark, so it's an important connection, isn't it, between birds, landscape, nature, everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even more so now when you're out there, Not so much in the old salient, but certainly down on the Somme and other parts of kind of now rural France, were rural France then as well, but are still rural France. Nature has reclaimed huge swathes of that landscape and is, almost as if nothing happened from their point of view. But interspliced within all of this are our little kind of totems to this war that happened over 100 years ago. And so I really wanted to, in those recent couple of lino cuts, it was wanting to have a creative output from the research was one element of it, but the other element was like you, that kind of wanting to bring a crossover of other interests, because with the best will in the world, I enjoy the painting the Great War, but I also enjoy and I'm interested in other things as well, and so it's nice to be able to kind of pair some of those things. And with the lino cuts, I'm obviously, the first couple have been to do with birds. There aren't that many bird-related cemeteries, but there is plenty of nature around other cemeteries, and that's what I'd like to start doing, is placing those cemeteries within their kind of modern context, but also with an echo of that wartime context. So the Owl Trench one, for example, that you've got, the white gouges out of it are where the trench lines were on the map. So you can again, you can see in that the trench line goes straight through the gateway, and then that was a weird cemetery actually, because the trench line runs through it, and the graves are laid out as if they kind of bisect the trench. So that I'm assuming that they're actually all buried kind of along the trench, but the gravestones go diagonally across them to tie in with the geometry of the rest of the cemetery. But that's kind of reflected in that lino cut as well. And it's, even with the non-First World War ones, it's and as I said, back at the start, the more and more I've thought about this research, the more it's about landscape and the echoes on landscape. And of course that translates beyond First World War cemeteries and First World War landscapes into many and various other landscapes that I find interesting as well.
And of course, the millions of men who were connected, who fought there rather in the Great War, were connected to the landscape long before they arrived on the Western Front, and grew up as young men, climbing trees to look in birds' nests and spotting birds and so on. And there was an officer that wrote a pamphlet for the Royal Ornithological Society, which is sort of a bird spotter's guide to the Somme, published in 1916. So they were looking at these things too.
Yeah, I think there are other elements that I find fascinating. There was a chap called John Henry Poole. You may be aware of him actually. He was a Sussex man, and he had been in the Rifle Brigade during the war, and came back after the war. Had been heavily gassed and was out wandering on the downs one day, getting fresh air, and stumbled across a Stone Age settlement site on the downs, and then just began excavating. Amateur archaeologist. And it got me thinking about how often you see that connection between, or the kind of the how the men perceived that connection between the rolling chalky Somme landscape and their home in the Sussex Downs. And it kind of got me thinking that apparently the reason he was able to recognise this kind of shift in the landscape was because he'd learned how to read landscapes being a soldier on the Western Front, and suddenly he's unearthing Stone Age sites. I think that kind of that interrelationship between the different landscapes is interesting. You think about, from an archaeological point of view as well, the kind of discoveries that are made in the 20s and 30s in Britain as a direct result of the development of aircraft spotter planes and aerial photography, and then the adaptation of that for spotting Roman roads and prehistoric settlements. And I think there's just the way the landscapes kind of speak backwards and forwards. It isn't just a kind of one-way memorial. It has a long-lasting echo in all the landscapes that we pass through.
Absolutely. I think it just again reflects the sort of myriad of connections that there are with the Great War.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you will know more than anyone. You can't get away from it. Once it's kind of hooked onto you, you try and read a novel that's loosely set within the 20s and 30s, even if nothing's said, you're still reading between the lines as to what the backstory is from their war service and their war history, and and you look for if you're reading anything from contemporary to the 20s and 30s, you look for the echoes, and then other times when you're not expecting it at all, they come out and find you. I mean, my own story with my family, with my great grandfather Edgar. My dad and I were due to go over and visit him, or visit his grave, on the 16th of April 2018, which would have been the 100th anniversary. But then my first son, his due date was the 14th of April. As it turned out, he came on the 10th, but his middle name is Edgar, after my great grandfather. Anyway, so that meant we had to postpone going to visit. Now, between Fernley being born and us actually going over in the August, my mum forced my dad to start tidying up the loft. And one day he came across a little briefcase from when he cleaned up my granddad's house. I opened it up, and there's a diary, there's letters from all his time at Sutton Veny. There was the brassard that he'd been wearing at the moment the shell, because he was killed by the blast of the shell rather than fragments. So the guy that he's with writes back to my great grandmother and says what's happened. And as I say, enclosed was the brassard that he had on when he was killed, but also the prayer book that he had in his hands at the moment that he was killed. And then there's a photograph of the grave that's been sent back after the war. And of course, we had none of this in the April. So when we went back we had other photographs of him as well. We had one portrait photograph from before this, and suddenly we had like 5 of them. And so what it meant was that we had a much, much clearer idea of who this person was. And we were able to take the brassard and the prayer book back to Adelaide Cemetery with us. And that all came about by happenstance. My son was born, so we couldn't go out there. And then Edgar came to find us before we went out there. And it's just the nature of it, isn't it? It always seems to happen that way.
Yeah, I think these things find you rather than you find them, really. It's a really strong part of that. I mean, this last year, we've, of course, not been able to get out to the battlefields as we might have liked. For you, when you get a chance to get back again, where will you go?
Plug Street, definitely. But also, I really I've missed the Somme. And rightly or wrongly, I always associate the Somme with summer. And so it's kind of, long days of walking and fields filled with crop. And, I love the Somme in May when the wisteria is starting to come out at Danzig Alley Cemetery. And you've got all the kind of rapeseed in the fields, and and you've got the longer days, but you've still got that kind of, because of the that kind of Ravilius-esque chalky quality of the light. Yeah, just there. No one particular place, it has to be said. Just generally cutting my way through the landscape and kind of feeling it fold in around you, kind of thing. And one of these days we'll get back out there.
We will. Well, thanks for joining us, Tim. It's been a fascinating chat about the work you've been doing. We'll put some links to you on Twitter and also your website with your artwork on. And I hope you'll come back and have another chat about cemeteries another day.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks ever so much for having me.
Thank you, Tim. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.